This session is Reaching Your Audience, a distribution study case on Mount Zion. What we've got here is our three panellists, and they are all quite diverse, but they're all connect. We've got Quinton Hita, is the Managing Director of Kura Productions, a television production company that's produced close to 500 hours of television, including Pukoro, Tokoreo, for Māori television, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Quinton is also the producer of Mount Zion. Just hired him as Andrew Cornwell. He's involved in the distribution of films both in cinemas and the home entertainment market, General Manager of Sony Pictures, and Sony Pictures is the licensee for Walt Disney in New Zealand. He's been directly involved in the distribution of a number of New Zealand films, and he has been a board member of the New Zealand Film Commission since 2006. And our last panellist, not least, is Sue May, who specialises in film publicity during production and release, which Sue will get onto after, which is quite specific, working on international films with 20th Century Fox New Zealand and New Zealand films with other distributors. Her projects since Mount Zion include Utu Redux, The Wolverine, is it The Cruise? The Cruise, Epic, yeah. Yep, and currently Stoker. She first worked with Sony on Vertical Limit, then Billy T. Te Movie, and then Mount Zion. Straight into it, Andrew, could you please give us a wrap-up of where Mount Zion is to date with box office, rankings, and all the other goodies?
Absolutely. Well, it's been a pretty successful film, both theatrically. We ended up at 1.3 million, which placed it the 13th best New Zealand film of all time, just below In My Father's Den. And just below above Scarfies. We were able to, also on the back of that, we were able to get a decent theatrical release. So it was a much more limited release, but certainly appealing to all those mozzies across the Tasman. We put it out on 14 screens in Australia. We did a box office of close to 200,000. On the back of that, which it doesn't happen very often, we were able to get it into our company's Channel 7 deal, so at some point it's going to be broadcasting throughout Australia on Channel 7, which is a pretty exciting. And without getting into the financial specifics, it's actually a very lucrative part of the deal. We've also released it on DVD, and currently we're sitting at about 10,000 units sold in the marketplace in New Zealand, and 4,000 to 5,000 in Australia. So, all in all, it's been a pretty good outing. Of course, it's still a work in progress because the film keeps going on and on forever, of course. So, yeah, we're pretty pleased, pretty chuffed.
So Mount Zion's huge success, it didn't just happen by chance. I know for many of us, we hope that our films or our TV will be successful. It wasn't by chance. There's a lot of planning going into it. Now, just for those who don't know, film distribution, the definition is the distribution of a film or movie is that process through which a movie is made available to watch for an audience. Now, I started with that because when we had this preliminary, there's so many ideas what distribution is. That is what distribution is, and I'd like to start with Quinton, the ups and downs, with some story up to Sony.
You guys are going to kick me afterwards for saying this, but because I was new to feature films, I really had no idea just how difficult it is to get a distributor on board. And maybe that naivety was an advantage, because I was quite happy to pick up the phone and ring Andrew and say, "Hi, I'm Quinton Hita, and I'd like to talk to you about distributing our feature film." But in terms of choosing to talk to Sony, pretty much in the first instance, that came about because I think once Te Arapa, the director, and I had decided we were going to go after Stan Walker to play the lead in the film, that sets a whole lot of other things in train. In a large way, I think it started to really define for us what the ultimate film was going to look like and the audience that we were going to be talking to. Having a high-profile young singer like Stan on board, a whole lot of expectations come with that. We can talk about that scripting process and that later if people are interested, but basically it clarified for us that it was going to be this type of movie. And then I think once you figure out what sort of movie it's going to be, you try and align yourself with a distributor who has expertise in that particular area. And then the only other thing I'd add was, it was clear to me, Stan was signed to, and is still signed to Sony Music. And my understanding was faulty at the time because I thought the whole Sony empire, music, film and everything else they do was one organisation. Turns out it's not quite like that, although there are relationships in place. But because Stan was signed with Sony, it just seemed to make sense that I should talk to Sony about distribution of the film, because there would be a lot of synergies there across these organisations. And so I contacted Andrew, and I'm sure there were Graham at the Film Commission felt similarly, having a lot of experience in film distribution and marketing himself. He thought Sony were the perfect distribution partner, and so I'm sure him and others might have been whispering in Andrew's ear, but when I finally went to talk to Andrew, there was initial interest, and we had a meeting. I remember Christine Massey, what's your official position?
National Sales Manager.
National Sales Manager. Christine Massey at the meeting. There was Melanie Ray,
Yep.
who looks after marketing at Sony. I think from memory, Christine said to Taurupa and I at that meeting that she'd had 100 scripts go past her desk in the last 6 months, and the reason she liked Mount Zion so much is it was uplifting. And that was the beginning of our partnership with Sony.
So Andrew, what does a distributor do at Sony? Because that's what everybody wants to know. And what do you expect from the producer?
The dark art. Well, I guess you know, the theatrical release is quite a high test. It's the highest test you have to meet, because you're competing, you know, for people's time and you know, and obviously their money. So it's a much more rigorous test than for, say, a movie of the week on television. So we, I guess, taking off from where Q left off, and we certainly had a look at, we had our initial meeting, I think it was in 2011, and though it was a pretty obvious audience, we thought it was good, but sort of not quite there yet, the script. We identified a couple of concerns, and one of the concerns that we had, I thought with the script the way it was it potentially would be an R-rated movie, and one of the things with the New Zealand audience, if you're producing an R-rated movie, it does actually limit your audience quite significantly. So we sort of encouraged both Q and T to have a look at that aspect, and as it turned out, they not only got it down to an M, which would have been okay, they actually made it a PG, and it was actually a perfect rating because it ended up being a great family film for everybody. So that was good, but people do have to turn up in sufficient numbers. We've had like, you know, someone might come and say, well, I've got a film about, I don't know, polo, and there are 20,000 people in New Zealand play polo, and if they all come to the movies, well, that doesn't sort of work that way, because there's a lot of pressure on screens from the exhibition side, and you really got to be able to generate sufficient volume, usually on your opening weekend, to be able to attract that interest. And New Zealand movies do take a lot of work. Quinton's kindly mentioned a couple of my staff who did all the real work, but obviously because of the resource required, we ended up getting Sue on board to actually drive the picture, because they are very difficult work. But just to sort of give you perhaps a little bit of a flavour of what it actually requires to get it over the line, to get a film over the line. Last year if you take all the films that were released in 2012 on wide release, and that's more than 30 screens, the median, the 56th movie was actually Two Little Boys, and that did $812,000. So half the films did more than that, and half the films did less than that. Now, if you take your 800, call it 800 grand box office as a starting point. Now that people may not realise, but that does include GST, and that's just the way worldwide the box office always reports, including tax. So straight away that 800, you've got to give about 105 of that back to the government in tax. So you're down to 696. Then there's another great slab comes off that, which is called effectively the exhibitors' share, and the exhibitors' share of the remainder is roughly 58%. So we as the distributor will only get 42%, and I guess you might initially think, gosh, that's a lot of money for they haven't even produced the movie or anything. But I guess it is a point what's known as the terms of trade in the business, and we're always arguing about how much the film's worth and how much it's not. and so on. But generally, to build a theatre, in fact, a decent complex, is very capital intensive. They're like planes. In New Zealand, buying a plane, and you also have to sign very long leases, so they're quite big commitments. So, although you could sort of argue about the margins, 58% is what you actually need to run a sustainable exhibition business. So, cutting that out, it leaves us like $292,000. And remember, we're talking about the median film here. So, to get a film away in New Zealand, and is at that sort of level, we're talking about 275 grand. With roughly 200 of that being on advertising costs and 75 on print costs. So you can probably just quickly do the maths yourself and then sort of figure out there's not a lot of money left on the median film. And if we end up paying in advance to get a movie, we that's another big hurdle. So the film would have to gross more than $1 million for us to even wash its face. So that's why when we look at it, it's got to be a tough test. It's got to be a rigorous test. It's got to be a test that we feel that the audience, that will attract a sufficient audience, because the 275 grand that we put up is that initially that is our risk. So in other words, if it fails, if it only did 300 grand, we'll end up with red brackets, and then it's all tears by bedtime sort of thing. So. And that's not a particularly good situation. We can recover a little bit on the home entertainment business, but as you probably gather from reading the press, the home ent business it's not as good as it used to be. Put it that way. It'll come again, but at the moment it's not as good as it used to be. So we certainly for that sort of scope of film, just to sort of paint the economics of it, just to sort of give a sense of what you actually need to do to actually get a theatrical release. But once you actually do recover your costs, and this is where it gets good from the producer's point of view, they really start to make the money, because obviously once we've recovered your P&A costs, as we call them, once we've taken our distribution fee, then the majority of the money after that goes back to the producer. And that's probably another good reason why you really, really want to have a good idea of your audience, because you get past a certain point and then you really actually start to make some money. So the difference, for example, on and hopefully with the maths I've just given you, the difference between making $1.3 million at the box office and 800,000 is actually from the producer's perspective actually quite a significant one. That's when they really start to sort of cut in. So we're always looking. We as a company we like to support New Zealand movies where we can, and certainly, we obviously had a good relationship with Barney, and he introduced us to Quinton. And we're obviously, as I said, we had a team reading. We liked the film. We suggested a few things, didn't we? To sort of, and then we sort of took up the mantle from there, really.
So this is a bit of a fairy tale situation. A new filmmaker with a major distributor. It's what everyone wants. A great team, and that's really rare, to take that kind of punt. I'm kind of interested, I think we all are, in especially the new filmmakers. Yes, good, I'm on the right track. Wanting to know how that relationship, because it's not just pick up the phone. You spoke to Barney, I think a bit more Quinton, about how the relationship between you both ended up with this hit film.
Once Andrew and his team committed to the film and said they were interested, it was a really cooperative relationship. We weren't overly precious. It was challenging at times. When you're dealing with creative personalities who are generally their work is obviously precious to them, and when you're having to make changes, like we wanted to broaden the audience out, so we wanted to make some changes so that the film could go out as a PG as opposed to an R. And all of those things, in hindsight, it seems like common sense, but of course, when you're dealing with creative personalities, it can be quite challenging to get over that stuff. Fortunately for me, Taurapa was pretty open to all the suggestions, so there weren't any major problems. And I do know that is often a stumbling block when you have a distributor come to you with a set of expectations, yeah? I mean, let's talk about expectations with a film, because this was really a major insight for me going through this process. When we started making this film, we really had no idea. We did probably 10 drafts. One was a comedy, One was a musical. One must be probably close to a horror movie. Basically we explored every possible genre with the basic spine still in place, because Taurapa was trying to find the story as we went along. Once we got Stan in place and all of that crystallised, then you get a distributor on board, and there's a set of expectations that come with that as well, because Sony, obviously, they're in the business of mainstream films. It was in our best interest, if the film was going to be a success, that it worked with families and as broad an audience as possible. We were pretty confident that we could get the brown, for lack of a better term, the brown audience on board, but we wanted to try and broaden it out from there as well to get as big an audience as possible. So, that required going back, Taurapa and I having lots of conversations about how we broaden the film out. And like I say, fortunately, Taurapa was very open to that process. And so it ended up being a really cooperative partnership moving forward. Oftentimes what you'll get is you might get a creative director or writer who's completely resistant to that. And I think that's where it can get problematic. And for me as a producer, one of my biggest concerns was that we would end up with a product that our distributor was miles away from what our distributor expected, and then I think you're in trouble.
Yep.
Because at that point, there's still a clause in the contract that says the distributor doesn't have to release the film theatrically if it doesn't meet their expectations. And so to reduce any possible risk of that happening along the way, we had lots of screenings for Andrew and his team, so they could at least see where we were going, and obviously different drafts of the scripts went to them to look at. So that's kind of an overview. I won't lie, there were some challenging moments with Taurapa is absolutely amazing, but in the spirit of being honest with people, I actually think that if the bro had been left to his own devices, he would have made, I better choose my words very carefully here. We've got, I'd like to acknowledge our executive producer, Christina Milligan, who's in the audience today. Also Savage over here, who's head of our design, production design. So we've got a few crew members here. I think he would have made a more sophisticated film. A more sophisticated film. Can I talk about this?
Yes,
Shall I
you
talk
can.
about this?
Should.
That's what they're here for.
This is the under the bonnet stuff.
Yes, more of that, under the bonnet.
It's a more sophisticated film, which is to say that the bro would probably wanted to have made a film with much fewer visual cues that make the Māori world in the film, and maybe even the visual style of the film, more accessible. Taurapa is an artist. I think he's an extraordinarily fine artist, and his natural instincts would have been to make something more along those lines. Once we realised that Stan was going to be the lead in our film, and we have Sony on board as a distributor, and now we are targeting this audience over here, and we made a conscious decision that we wanted the film to attract as big an audience as possible. We then had to go back and start including some of those visual cues, some of those script cues that was going to make the world more accessible. Now, for those of you that saw Mount Zion, I don't know how you got on with the dialect, the South Auckland Pukekohe dialect, but I can tell you that was a very pale version of the original dialogue that the bro wrote for this film. The original dialogue, I think, if you weren't from South Auckland, was impenetrable. Now, and to be, I think that would have resulted in a more sophisticated film. But you make a decision and you go, okay, now this is actually the audience that we need to get and we want to talk to, so you make those compromises. And that all happened as part of the process of working with our distributor.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also conscious of the fact we're at the pointy end of the business, and it's where art and business collide. And I did say to Taurapa at the end, you were happy from an artistic point? And he said, yeah, no, he was. He was actually pretty happy. But I was sort of conscious, but this sort of, I guess, I wouldn't say conflict, but this sort of issue, it does arise even in the biggest of Hollywood productions, and there's been very notable cases of directors having free reign, and then they show the studio where nothing can be done, and then it all goes pear-shaped from that point of view. But one thing I would say is that particularly for a first-time filmmaker, I think it's important to get some success. Because at the end of the day, you hopefully go on to make 2, 3, 4, or 5 films, and then one of those films can perhaps be a bit more artistic and a bit more arty, for want of a better word, and perhaps a bit less commercial. But I think certainly, and given the fact that resources are pretty tight in New Zealand, and the money's limited, and we're trying to create careers, trying to give people a head start in their career, I think it would be a wiser move to stare down a more, try and get the biggest audience possible, of course without compromising the artistic integrity of what you're trying to achieve. But I think it's certainly something in the overall package I think people have to seriously consider.
I'm going to move to another area now. Are there any questions in this point here? Because we're going to go somewhere else now. Yes?
Hi, I'm Sam, and I'm interested in how Sony New Zealand kind of works within Sony Pictures.
Sony, well, yeah, sure. Just quickly, because we are as you say, a bunch of different companies. We do actually operate now out of the same office, but essentially we're quite independent. But one of the advantages of operating out of the same office, we can actually talk to each other quite quickly, because a couple of times, I had an idea and I'd go around to Sony Music and I'd say, can you put this on Stan's Facebook page, because he's got like 300,000 followers. So that made it a very easy thing to do. And the old way we did it made it a little bit difficult. But definitely we're 4 completely separate reporting lines, and they're quite big companies in their own right.
I'm actually meeting Sony Pictures around the world. Like, how much overseas do they say when you choose the films you want?
Okay. Well, we generally for the local stuff, they don't really have any say. They just hope we know what we're doing, and generally they'll judge us by the result. For obviously we have a slate. Just generally we have a slate of movies, and we make a call on whether we think we should release them or not in New Zealand. If there are films we for example decide they're just too hard.
Okay, so there's a certain amount of autonomy.
Certain within, yeah, correct. Yep.
Yes.
Thanks, Nick. Question for Quinton. When you were talking about the South Auckland dialect and making it, let's call it a more authentic, perhaps, piece of work, I imagine the question of subtitling came up.
Certainly did.
And what
Did you hear the question?
Your reason for moving away from that?
So the question, you mean subtitling of the English, because
Yes.
the dialect is so strong.
Yes.
I think for the New Zealand audience, we felt that people would understand enough to be able to enjoy the film. In terms of an international audience, for the copies of the film that have been sent internationally for various reasons for people to look at, they have been subtitled, because the feedback we got has been that it would be too hard for people to understand and to follow the language being spoken in the film. Yeah.
I guess we initially thought on the first cut that there were some problems. I think they were largely resolved through the sound process. They, yeah, a little bit, because again, if an audience struggles to sort of quite pick up the film's moved on and your brain's trying to catch up, so it was definitely a point, of discussion, particularly after the first cut. But I think by the time the product, I don't think that was an issue at all.
I did think though that if you listen to so I came from this place, which was the original script was impenetrable. After years of hammering away at Te Arepa and trying to cajole them in every possible way, we finally watered that down a bit to a point where only 50% of the people who read the script didn't understand it. And so we finally got it in front of our distributor, and they said, well, we don't understand some parts of it, so we identified which were the main offenders, and then in post and through other various ways we addressed those issues. Now I understand, I think though, that it was still probably quite challenging for a lot of even a New Zealanders. Yeah, a lot of New Zealanders. But I think we thought I personally thought that we sort of, as a nation, we've gotten close enough to Pukekohe to put it out there and challenge people and hopefully start to build that communication bridge where maybe in the future when people go and see those films and as we evolve as a nation with all of this melting pot of cultures, it's going to become less and less of a problem. It could have been a lot worse.
Personally for me, I didn't mind, not being completely clear about what's going on. I was perfectly happy with that. But I do understand about overseas audiences.
And then there was the Māori dialogue, and if it had been up to Te Arapa, who's generally, to be fair to him, he wants to represent the world that he's created to be represented truthfully. Even the Māori dialogue, probably he wouldn't have supported that being subtitled. But for our funders, our people with a vested interest, that was one bridge too far. So we did put subtitles up for the Māori dialogue.
Yes, one more. Yes.
Is this usual to have this close working collaboration between distributors during the actual script writing process?
I would say.
Generally, probably not, but I think it's a good idea. It's certainly a good idea, and certainly, particularly where we're at script stage, it's much easier to sort that sort of stuff out before you actually get into production, rather than when it's at the cinema. By then it's sort of too late. So I think certainly any film that we are involved in, and we did the same with Billy T as well, the Billy T movie. We would like to be involved, and and like to think we've got something to contribute. And again, it's a collaborative process. Obviously, filmmaking is quite collaborative, and but we're part of that process as well. I mean, people can. I mean, the director or producer they can always ignore us, but again, you run the risk of bad things happening to the movie. So and I guess you've got to make you call exactly how you want to go.
We're going to come back to more questions. We'll just keep it moving because we just want to have a wee break. Sue, I'm going to cut to you. Can you just talk about media, New Zealand, Mount Zion? Away you go. Go for it. No, she's got some really interesting things that are the interesting stuff. Some unusual ones as well.
What I felt after thinking about this quite seriously for the last few days and going back over my notes and trying to remember everything that I did, and we did do a lot, I realised that there's a hell of a lot of really specific detail that I could talk about, but I decided not to do that. But this morning I woke up with the simplest way through it. The realisation is that actually the most relevant thing I can say to you as filmmakers, after you've heard what these two have said, is that it all actually comes back to the film. If the film is made with the awareness of who it's being made for, and if it's a story well told with heart and some unique factors, like Mount Zion had obviously the extraordinary voice of Stan Walker, and not just his following that came with him, but his voice and his talent as well, then the publicity flows from that. And so what we had was a film that we knew that we were proud of, and that we had confidence in. And what that enabled me to do was to put the case for, and it was no argument really, but that we would have an early media screening, and we'd have a one later on. The reason I wanted the early one, and I'm talking about November for a February 6th release, I wanted that one in November to show it not just to reviewers, but to show it to media who would potentially write stories, because I know that if they see a film early, that affects your chance of getting a story. If they haven't seen it, then they might go with one of your angles that you pitch to them. But in my position, I was in a much stronger position to pitch stories to the people that had seen it. And that did have a lot of really direct results. We got some really big media outlets on board at that point. The other thing to talk about is publicity assets. Obviously, the film itself is I've just said it's the biggest publicity asset, but the other one is the people. So, and what we had with that was the actors, particularly Stan, as we've talked about, with his following and his media skills, but also the awareness of the certain media in the area, in the niche where he works, because there was a lot of people that haven't heard of him that we had to introduce him to. And we had Temura Morrison, who is just the publicist's dream. He will, well, basically anybody interviewing Tem has a really enjoyable experience, so that's cool. The other thing in the people area of assets that we had was Te Arapa himself. We introduced him to the media at that first screening, and that also generated interest in people going, wow, who's this guy? Eloquent in both languages, take him anywhere, talk about anything.
Yep, it was very good with the exhibitors too.
Yes.
In Hamilton.
Yes, that's right.
Yep.
So all of those things are persuasive. The other area of great human assets we had were the people of Pukekohe. All those people that were involved in the film, we showed them. There were 2 early previews in Pukekohe, one on the Sunday night before the release for the cast and crew, and obviously that involved a lot of the local people because they were very closely involved in making the film. And then we had the cinema ran its own preview on the Tuesday night before the release. So there was this whole massive upswelling of people there that saw it and loved it, and they talked about it. They really helped our Facebook campaign immensely and took it to Australia via Facebook as well. Somebody said, and I wish I could remember who it was, that Facebook is the digital marae, and that young Māori are really good at using it, and we certainly plugged into that really well. The other human asset we had was a couple of the mothers of a couple of the cast members who got right in behind this. Particularly Troy Kingy's mother, and also combined with a friend of mine from Kerikeri, they organised their local premiere where they had a green carpet from the cricket club, and they had sacks of spuds, and they really went all out. And also Stan Walker's mother.
Yep.
She organised something we didn't even know she'd done until after she'd done it, was that she bought the whole session at Tauranga on the opening day and got the local media along. Stan and Tem both went along too, and it was like that was their premiere, and the reason she said she did it was for Stan to give tickets to his whānau and kaumātua.
Yep.
She did the other thing she did as well was in the Gold Coast, she actually organised a whole premiere there. She bought 800 seats and then on-sold them. And she did that about 4 times.
Yep. And sorry, could I just say, and on the strength of that, she was offered the role of the publicity manager for the whole Pacific Fair shopping mall. They were quite impressed with her.
Yeah.
She's a force of nature.
Yeah, just phenomenal. She also persuaded David Wakaira Paul's partner to do a similar thing in Sydney, and she got the Sydney City Roosters, or whatever they called, the league team, to come along to support that premiere. It was just that was just kind of taking off through all those networks, and there was another woman somewhere else that was persuaded to do a similar thing. So, in future, I'm going to really look hard at who are the mothers of the cast and what can they do with us.
What can they do for us?
Yeah. And support them to the hilt. And actually, it would have been really cool if we'd done a few more of those in retrospect, thinking about that. But it was quite spontaneous. So that's the materials. Obviously, are the other publicity assets, which is the trailer and the clips and the music video and the poster and the printed press kit and the EPK and all those things that I work on during a shoot to get them made. That's the other asset. So then what I look at as well is who are the media outlets that are going to be interested in these angles. So yeah, the angles are the other asset too. So which outlets are going to be interested, and then it's a matter of just doing this whole kind of juggling of matching the outlets with the angles, with the people and the timing. And that's kind of the game of the publicist, really.
You want to talk about the poster things that we were...
Yeah. Okay. We had a little, what I think of as a little bit of a culture clash in a way about the poster, because the filmmakers shot a fabulous image that was in mind to be the poster. And when, shall we show that now? Or show
Yes.
it? Yeah, we'll show it when we've got the compare. Oh no, let's put that one up. The photo.
The water tank one.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was shot with telling the story of the film kind of in mind, you know, the young man looking outward, out to the world, the father looking over his shoulder, kind of, you know, dig the spuds boy, and the other guys up the background, and everyone looking all a bit staunch.
And why wasn't that chosen?
Well,
'Cause
the
we said-
distributors looked at it.
We said no. No, we thought we thought it didn't necessarily convey positivity, uplift. You know, our sales manager thought they would look as though they're about to perhaps rob a bank. She was quite, and so we did have this discussion on the whole thing. And I think generally, as just as a comment, and I think as part of that whole, particularly the pre-production process, or part of the production process, is to make sure whatever the stills are, that the stills that you can actually use and capture the essence of the film, and maybe a variety of different ways, so you've got a few more options. But we ended up with something that we I guess I thought we all could live with, for want of a better word.
And this
And-
one actually came in handy anyway because that was the cover of Herald
Yeah.
Time Out, so wasn't a waste of time or energy. So
No, it wasn't. No, it all got used, but certainly the actual, you know, we liked what I guess Stan's quite obviously dominant. He's singing. And I think the essence of the movie in the bottom part's conveyed. It probably, I guess, if we had another 20 grand or so, we might have wanted to go out and have another go at
reshoot
it.
it. Yeah.
But sometimes we have to roll with what we've got, and we end up being sort of happy with that. And the trailer is the other, obviously the key component, because that gets used a lot, particularly obviously these days in an online environment as well as actually in cinema itself. So we were actually pretty happy with the outcome of the trailer. Generally the trailer is cut not by the production crew. There's a specialist. In fact, I think it was cut by someone in New York. In fact, but it wasn't. It's a separate process, and we were very happy with the outcome of that. But are obviously the two key components in terms of creating an audience are your trailer and your key art, because a lot of people, I mean, we often, because we're in the film business and we think that's all people think about all day, but in fact, the average person in the street just take one look at it and think, no, I don't like that, and that's your film gone. Or it might rain, it might be fine that weekend and no one goes, and it's things like that. Where people don't think and breathe movies out there in the real world as much as we do.
The thing we did with that though is put it on the back of the buses.
Very good.
Yeah, and that worked really well.
It also,
and people felt that made it look like a bigger film than
Yeah.
what it is.
because we didn't have a big budget. This was I think a total spend ended up, including the premiere, was around about $215,000. Well, that's not okay. It's not bad, but it's not. I mean, for example, with Bond or Iron Man, we'd spend $400, just to give you a bit of a sense of where it is. So 200's okay, but again, if we'd spend 300, then all those economics I talked about before, we spend an extra $100,000, we've got to get an extra 300 grand in box office to pay for that. That's where it gets a bit interesting, and that's the call you have to make as a distributor. So, but that's but one of the things we did, we decided on the bus backs because we wanted to give it a sense of it was a big movie, because generally think, it's on the back of a bus, or it must be big, so or it must be at least this big,
One of the issues now for a lot of things, say Māori, and young people full stop, is piracy.
Yes.
And this movie, if I'm being pragmatic, made a lot of money when our community could easily have tried to pirate the movie.
Mm-hmm.
But Q, you had a few ideas of why you thought the piracy wasn't as full on as we thought it could have been.
Yeah, I thought this film was a really encouraging example of maybe how we can, we know that our kids can copy anything, and how we can protect our intellectual property. Because this film, for whatever reason, I think it was the Māori Kumaravine, really, that was working very hard for this film, particularly through Facebook. So we seem to connect all these Māori communities around the country. who all had a rally that was working in the film. I mean, having Pukekohe as a base and having so much of local Pukekohe residents, so many of them involved in the film, helped create that. And then what started to come through on the Facebook is we started seeing messages from people saying, you know, you copy this film, I'm going to come in and break your kneecaps. And this was happening and completely independent of anything that we were doing. I mean, it was quite amazing actually.
And in Australia as well.
And at first I didn't believe it, so, you know, I rung up the Cuzzy out in South Auckland. You know, close your ears, Andrew, would be one of the worst perpetrators of
I'm sure.
of copying films. And I said to him, there's a rumour out there that there's a bootleg copy of our film being sold. This was before it was released. And I said to him, what's the story, bro? And he said, oh, okay, I'll suss it out. And he came back to me the next day and he said, I've been everywhere in South Auckland and I can't get my hands on a copy. So from what I understand, it's quite common is people will go out there and say that they've got a bootleg copy of the film. Then when you say, okay, I'd like a copy, they'll turn around and say, oh, look, we've just run out, give me your details and I'll contact you in a couple of weeks, in the hope that by that stage they will have an illegal copy of your film. So a lot of that goes on, but it was really encouraging, you know, when the bro came back and said, no, and word is people aren't gonna pick it up.
Another person who was really vocal about that was King Kapisi, because he was in the film, of course, too, but he was putting the word out in a big way, don't do it.
I think we know from our own sort of research that there is the moral compass is, in fact, definitely for local films and local music a little bit higher than international stuff.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Rachel. So could you just talk a little bit more about the social media campaign and how that worked? Like what strategy you used or...
We didn't have any money to spend on it, so I just started a Facebook page and just started uploading things. I got the people on the crew that I knew that were into Facebook in the very early days to spread the word, and then it just kind of went. Obviously we put the trailer up, but we released the trailer first of all as an exclusive with nzherald.co.nz, and that turned out to be a really good way of getting it out broadly. And then I just kept engaged with it. Te Arapa was engaged with it as well. And if anyone looks back on it, all the straight up posts are mine and all the arty, poetic ones are his. So we had a kind of balance there. And then, you know, those Pukekohe people, it reached a point where it was growing sort of like that, and then suddenly it went like that. And Australia. But the large majority of people that like the page are New Zealanders.
Was it just Facebook?
It was linked to Twitter.
Twitter, that was it?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and Stan, of course, had his own page.
Oh, Stan, there's of course, yes, there's the Stan factor. And Stan is also Twitter and Instagram. So, yes, and so we gave him some stills and they had the trailer, obviously, and that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just relating to that, what sort of duration is the PR campaign for a film like this from? I mean, obviously during production, but when, like, I'll give you my sort of situation. I've got a film, it's in the sub $150,000 where it goes, trying to get it out, looking to get it out there, but trying to also make a judgment between saturation before sales and, you know, when we're like putting too much stuff out there too quickly, and or make sure we've got enough that it hits all when we get a release date. You know, so what sort of duration was the sort of campaign for this film, and how much lead time do you think you need a PR person to be on board for?
Well, I was there during the shoot because the materials are my responsibility. We did some publicity during the shoot, largely responsive to requests, and that was from Māori television. Te Kaya came out and did a set visit, and also TV1 Marae Investigates did a really cool item, and the Herald on Sunday came out, but I wasn't actively pushing it that much during the shoot. because there's such a long gap.
Yeah.
And what happens is if you start full on during your shoot and then you've got your whole post-production period where you've got nothing to say, you've got to then reboot it all again anyway. Because this was a February the 6th release date, as I said, we had to have our first media screening in November, which meant that before that I was busy. I probably started coming to meetings. When we had meetings in about August, September or something, I think.
Quite a lot. No,
I
well
can't
before
remember.
then.
Did we? Oh.
Yeah, no, it was well before then. We had Terrapper actually came down to, we had an exhibitors conference in Hamilton.
Oh, that was during the shoot.
Yes, that was, I think it was May,
Yeah.
it was like the May before the release, so we actually thought it was really important to get them in front of the exhibitors, because other ones, remember they take 58% of the revenue, and they're the ones that are actually pretty key, they're actually the front and centre with the consumer. So we got him down there, and he was actually great. The exhibitors loved him.
And
put on a
Tim
great
went
show.
too.
Tim went as well, of course, and so that's effectively from a trade marketing point of view. It started, up to just about a year before. Yeah, quite a long time.
But bearing in mind as well is that I never work on any film full time, so it's all and every film is different. Is the other thing.
Yeah, speaking of the internet, I'm interested from a distributor's point of view about like the video on demand stuff and maybe why it isn't here yet, even though I would happily pay
putting
money
movies
for it.
out.
Yeah.
Have it on demand. And is that economic? Does that make economic
Oh,
sense?
it makes complete economic sense. In fact, video on demand is actually here through you can get it through Apple, get it through QuickFlix. I mean, one of the
More than Netflix.
you do. I think you do. It's definitely the second window, though. It's not. I don't think it replaces the theatrical release, but what we're effectively it is a channel that we're trying to grow quite hard at the moment. My number one goal for this year is actually how do we actually create more online distribution, and certainly it's a growing source of revenue. It's off a small base, but it's growing pretty fast. Certainly, obviously people are aware of DVD shops and JV Hi-Fi and so on, but and they'll still be there, but gradually the online version will take over.
Does that affect the way you negotiate like the distribution stuff?
No, it's essentially just another channel.
Okay.
It's another channel, but it does take a lot of cost out of it because you're not having to make product, ship product. It's actually quite profitable. So, and potentially you can get pricing down. If you get pricing down, more people will buy it, and so on. So, it actually is a very positive development for the business, and one we're looking to really max out on. But as you say, it's getting people to come here is the problem, and the big companies, international companies. I mean, I'm talking to a couple of local people now, trying to get them pushed down that way, because that's the way of the future. Sorry.
When was the release date set? How far away? Because it was a really important symbolic date, and so how far away was that?
Quite some months. We did have a because dating is quite important. In fact, I might might put that chart up now, and I might just this is one of the dark arts of the business. So just to sort of. So this is what we work off as an industry, and you can see just sort of there are all the dates down the left. There are all the distributors, and all the films are in the middle, and we were quite conscious of the fact because it was shot in summer, we did actually want to release it in summer. But I guess when you're actually putting a date, and this is getting back to your audience thing, you've really got to choose that quite carefully, because if you choose, for example. You can see Mount Zion is here. This is sitting here on February the 6th. It was pretty much chosen because we didn't want to bring it into the holidays, because if we brought it into the holidays, there's a lot of other stuff, including a small film called The Hobbit that's just sort of hanging around. We didn't want to do that, and consequently, if you release it too far down into here, you're starting to run into the next holiday. So we wanted to find a date that was actually in summer, that we could actually have the sort of publicity angle all to ourselves. We weren't competing with, you wouldn't want to compete with something like Oz the Great and Powerful, which is another film where our companies are releasing as well, a bit further down here. So we actually had what we thought was a pretty good date, and then generally, I don't know if people know, some movies usually come out on a Thursday in New Zealand, but obviously being Waitangi Day, being February the 6th, a Wednesday, and just happily Bob Marley's birthday, It's sort of the date really chose itself in the end, and obviously with a public holiday, you actually get quite a surge in business, and in fact it turned out to be an inspired choice because we ended up doing 200,000 on its opening day and out of the box office of 1.3 million. So. And it was a perfectly fine day. I do remember it very well, sort of because as obviously
nerve-wracking day.
as the person with and I was feeling for these guys as well because it's like waiting for a baby to be born. It's sort of like oh my, and people were saying to me, well, how much do you think it's going to do? And I'm thinking, oh God, I hope it does if it does 100,000, I'll be doing cartwheels. That's what I said. And if I was less than 10,000, I'll be jumping off a bridge, and that was sort of how we sort of roll. But at 200,000, it was like triple cartwheels and backward somersaults. So it was fantastic. But certainly the dating is probably obviously having, as Sue said before, having a good film is definitely the number one asset. But even having a good film, you've really got to be quite careful with your date. And I remember with Billy T2 movie. We dated that around about this time of year actually because it's just after the American, because there's always a little bit of a hole at this time of year, and it's just after all the American blockbusters of the summer because there's a lot of movies come out June and July. So we work because you are competing with bigger budgets, bigger stars, and all. There's a lot of things that are against you, so you really need to think about their date quite carefully. But we did sort of, and we do choose every date. We sit around at the table and talk about a lot of stuff about, if someone moves this date up to here, okay, what does that do for this film and do we change it around? So there's a lot of, thinking about dates, discussion with exhibitors, but it's a really key element of your strategy, and it's something that a good distributor should be able to sort of help and guide you on, but I couldn't stress sort of how important that is. So that's what it looks like. It's one of the key tools that the industry uses to date films, and I hope it was some insight.
It shows you how busy it is. That I review films, and some weeks you've got 6 or 7 films open.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I mean, I think there were 306 films released in 2012. So a lot of them are smaller movies, of course. Not all of the blockbusters, but you can, and often. I mean, I'll give you another example. For our sins, we're releasing the movie White House Down. And there's another one called Olympus Has Fallen, and it was exactly the same. And so we didn't want to go anywhere near that because, again, you got 2 films so we've actually dated it, and you can't see it, it's down in September the 6th. But so there's a lot of thinking, there's a lot of strategy behind picking a date. It's not just something that you just sort of run with.
So the fact that Mount Zion came out on a Wednesday meant that we got the jump on all the Thursday releases in that week, which is Silver Linings Playbook and whatever else I can't see over there.
Correct. So
Lincoln.
Yeah. But Lincoln was I mean, there's a lot of when you're releasing in February, there's a lot of Academy type films. There's quite it's a very strong Academy window. So sorry, there's a question.
So you had all this great publicity spin off into Australia.
Yes.
How closely do you work with Australia in terms of release, distribution, all that kind of stuff?
Well,
they were a month apart.
They were 6 weeks apart, and obviously they were waiting. I mean, I'd obviously teed them up, and because obviously you generally release in a market, you release in your home market first, and then if it goes well, then it gets pushed out. But we sort of made the call pretty much after opening weekend that we wanted to go in Australia. In Australia, we're quite happy to release it, and of course it was a completely different strategy in Australia. We only spent $35,000, but we only went on 13 screens. But we did, for example, in the Pacific Fair, I think we were number 2 over the opening weekend, and in Perth, in the biggest multiplex in Perth, we were number 1. So that was a pretty good. And it actually did double what our Australian team thought, by the way. So they thought it was only going to do 100. But one thing about Mount Zion, it's always surprised people. It's always done better. Like in the rental stores, it's rented better, it's sold more. Everyone's like, oh, it sold better than I thought. Well, sorry, yep.
Yeah, I was just wondering, on that note about things doing better or worse, is there a lot of tracking in Australasia? I mean, the States tracking.
There's a lot of tracking in Australia.
Yeah.
We don't have tracking here, but generally we can sort of. But tracking can be a little bit of a misleading science sometimes. Yeah. Well, I've seen. Tracking is when you talk to people and you say, are you interested in this film? Are you going to go and see it? So you do that several weeks out, and ideally you sort of see what the level of interest is, and then when you start your advertising, you should see a peak you know, you're hoping, but if the line keeps going straight, you know, you're a little bit of trouble, but it can throw off some misleading information sometimes.
Well, a lot of times when the studio sends stuff through to you that you're throughputting, you're sort of handed on the platter of all the public stuff.
Yes.
Do they also tell you, hey, this is how much you're going to spend, this is where you're going to spend it, how long?
Not. They sort of rely on us to tell them. I mean, they have to approve it, but generally they rely on us. I mean, you might get, for example, you'll get like 10 TV commercials, 10 different, and we will pick 2 or 3, but we can't just go and invent our own one because there are things like talent approvals and. You know, if you're dealing with Will Smith, you can't, you know, decide, you know, we're going to show him this way, and, you know, and so on. So there are a package of stuff that we get, but certainly they occasionally they'll say for whatever reason, we want you to spend a lot more money than we're recommending, or sometimes a lot less, and then we just do what we're told in that situation. But generally we'll come up with a strategy, A, whether to release it, and B, how much to spend, and so on. And obviously we work with our Australian, and you know, we tend to be sort of roughly in line, although there are a lot of differences between Australia and New Zealand. It's not cut and paste, that's for sure. So.
Right. And then on the opposite side of that, usually when you're getting movies in, you've already got your platter of stuff.
Yes.
When you've got something here,
yes.
you have to make up all
correct.
Stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely true. And one of the and actually one of the things about working on New Zealand films, which is sort of good for the staff, is not that they would probably agree, but you know, it's good to have that sort of involvement with the producer, because we don't really have that. The studio has that involvement with the directors and the producers. So, and we have to originate a campaign. So it's actually, you know, something a little bit different than you normally do. So it's actually quite a good thing.
So like sometimes you get gaps between films. Is
Yep.
that your guys' choice where to release it in New Zealand like a couple of months later? And has that changed due to privacy?
Correct. Well, generally the dates, in fact, it's an interesting, because there's a bill before Parliament at the moment to extend the parallel import window for 3 years, because there are reasons for different dates. But we're gradually aligning our dates with the US, but there's still a lot of good reasons why we may not. For example, school holidays. Like the Smurfs, which is another film our company's releasing. It's just released in the US. I mean, it would be crazy for us to release it now, but that's not what the consumer wants either. So, and there also sometimes there are other movies you're not quite sure how they're going to go. So you might wait to see how the US, and then you go, okay, they did okay, so we will release it. So yeah, that's cool. Probably, should we take one more? Yeah, I better sit down.
Sony Pictures, do you have the rights worldwide for DVD and VOD from outside? Because one of the frustrations that I've got is I've just made a docudrama and I've got a DVD distributed here, and
Yep.
I need another one in Australia and another one in the States.
Yeah, I don't know what you're saying.
There's all these contracts.
It's a mirror of the thing. We don't actually have the rights, but we only have Australia and New Zealand rights at this point. But however, we could do a deal.
If Andrew can get us a good deal, we're more than happy to discuss it.
Because I mean we could turn Apple on for the world tomorrow if we had the right, and it might be the way to do it. For example, depending on how I don't know how the international sales are going exactly, but you know that's the sort of thing, and particularly digital distribution. You know, the VOD type and EST type thing, that actually gives you that opportunity to do that.
We need companies that can offer DVD and VOD distribution worldwide, because I've kind of become unstuck with that bit.
Generally, all the studios can do that. I mean, because I guess VOD and EST is just, that's digital distribution versus physical distribution. It's just all, it's not the same thing, because they're obviously different things, but it's just like saying the warehouse and JB Hi-Fi. But I know what you say. The problem is when you've got multiple distributors all over the world, how do you actually even keep track of what's going on? It's a little bit.
It's expensive, all the contracts.
Yep.
Masters.
Totally. Totally.
I'd love to just sign a contract with one.
Yeah, certainly that's and certainly it's something we as a company can do. But obviously, I think for each film you've got to consider your international plan as well. But maybe the best plan is say give it to us, and then we can just turn on some of these big digital customers. It's just because they've got the product, it's sitting up there because we, for example, for Mount Zion, we had to send the master to LA. We've got this bunch of people called the Worldwide Product Fulfillment Group, and they just supply assets to all these digital customers worldwide. So they've already done that, but to Apple and a couple of other customers in Australia and New Zealand, and all they have to do is more or less say, just click the little box that says the rest of the world, and away you go. It's probably not as simple as that, but anyway.
You're working on our American friends, aren't you?
Some of you heard this morning at Who Gives a Damn About New Zealand Film, they mentioned about Anzac Day being quite an important day. You've seen here they've said Waitangi Day. I'm going to get to Quinton in a minute, but things, whilst they seem, oh my gosh, they just happened, are actually quite well planned. I think anyone who makes stuff actually does understand. You understood this very well about releasing on those dates, and the premiere we're going to talk about now.
It's the right,
how that's
right film on the right day.
Yes, right film on the right day. So,
yeah.
Quinton, talk about that.
Well, I think that's just another reflection of the relationship really with the distributor. I mean, it's all credit to Andrew and his team. All of the stuff he's just been through, none of these decisions really were made in isolation. I mean, Andrew's discussed all of this stuff with me, the producer of the film, along the way. Maybe that's a reflection of his personality and his management style, but it certainly had a positive result in the end. So, we've been kept well informed along the way. And I just think that, from my point of view as a producer, I know a lot of producers like to be very, very hands-on. Everyone has their own different style. For me, personally, if it was in Sony's hands, I was quite confident that they were going to do the best job possible for the film. That's obviously experts at marketing and distributing these types of commercial mainstream films. And the same with Sue. I'm sort of that type of producer that you get someone on board that knows how to do their job, and you let them get on with it. I do like to be informed in that, but all of the decisions that these guys were making made perfect sense to me. Otherwise, you get into a situation where you're trying to do everybody's job all the time. If anybody here is of that persuasion, good luck. When you're talking about a film experience, and this particular film was 7 years in the making, so that's way too much time to be running around doing everybody's jobs for them. Just another reflection of the good relationship, really.
I mean, what were some of your best experiences?
Mine?
Yeah.
Working with a real community is actually a real buzz. So, and working with a project that has a real heart and feels like it's maybe more than just. I guess all movies should be like this. It feels like it's more than just making content. Tautupa had a personal investment in it, working with the bro, because he's just so talented. What a real pleasure and honour to be able to work with a genuine artist. I should reiterate just how important it was with Tautupa. And I know this may be the exception of the rule. He's just that type of person. He's so charming in person. I think he did have he did have a really positive impact on our marketing campaign and that as well. When he was taken to the exhibitors conference, I'm not sure you'd take every director to an exhibitors conference.
No.
But Tautupa, he's the sort of guy that he'll come into a room, which is why I never get these gigs. It's always him, and the only reason he isn't here today is because he's in Rarotonga writing. Otherwise he'll be here. And he's one of those guys who come into the room, and if he was introducing you to the film Mount Zion, he'd be standing up saying, "Okay, now who remembers this song from when they were at school?" He's that sort of dude, He just charms everybody. I think he had all the ladies up on the dance floor by the end of the night. So he was a real asset as well. Sue, I think.
Oh, yes.
Tautupa was a real asset.
Yeah, in fact, it was certainly I was quite keen to get him front and get him as much exposure as possible, because he is actually a very positive force.
And he did lots and lots of interviews.
Yeah.
Possibly.
The film festival circuit out there now, is Sony going to be involved in that aspect, or is that now full? Is it going back to another NZ Film Commission? Is it Imaginative, Sundance, things like that? Is that an area you...
We're not really handling the international side of it. That's not our gig at the moment. But so certainly it's done its theatrical run. I mean, I'm certain it'll come back at some point for various festivals or wherever.
Every Waitangi day.
It's going to be on.
Yeah.
Re-released.
It's going to be re-released.
Cool idea.
Well, it's not a bad idea, mate. could go for that. It's all, and we're all, and, you know, the good news is we're all, you know, we've covered our costs and it's all profit from here on in. And of course, you know, getting back, the more you attract the audience, the more, you know, you get your costs back, you start getting some money back for yourself for your next movie. That's sort of, you know, the message that I'd sort
Hold on, so you've got your costs back.
We've got all the costs have been back, and so therefore, not necessarily the production costs.
So I'm just getting this, some of us will think, won't we? So you've got your costs back.
Yeah, we've got our costs back, but certainly every dollar we make now, you know, will go back to it goes back to Quinton's company, and I don't know what happens exactly with it at that point, but certainly, you know.
Without getting into details, that's, from what I've heard, that's becoming quite unusual for producers to actually receive any money. Congratulations! Yay! I haven't received anything off any of my films.
Well, thank you. And if we had more time, I'd put that into context. It's not a lot of money.
Yeah, no, it's not for 7 years hard labour.
No, which really drove home the point to me that if you're going to produce a film, make sure you pay yourself properly during production.
So would you say?
Because what we tend to do is to get projects across the line as we cut our fees, and I work in television most of the time, and you can put up with that because it's somewhat sustainable. And if you're working for 7 years on a project, and given the economics of filmmaking, I would suggest that you don't do that when you produce a film. You need to make sure that you're paying yourself properly.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit I tend to cringe a little bit when I hear about deferrals, you know, because there are a lot of films that don't get their costs back, you know, and then it's all, yeah, it's not a good thing. So, certainly not.
Yeah, well, for me, there were lots of highlights in this campaign, running this campaign, but the biggest one, and I think it was a smart thing that we did as well, was that we brought, for the premiere week, we brought the 5 main actors to Auckland, and that wasn't cheap necessarily, and so that they could do lots and lots of interviews. So we had a really complicated schedule of junkets and radio interviews and performances, and just putting the actors in front of the media in that really immediate sense, and seeing how well they cope with it, also having the opportunity to put the inexperienced ones like Darcy Ray with Tim, and seeing the mentoring that went on there, that we got Darcy Ray to the point where he was saying a bit more than awesome. That was fantastic. Yeah, I think it was a really good idea to have that extended. It was kind of like 3 mornings in a row where they, you know, and the premiere as well. Let's talk about that. That was Monday night for the Wednesday release. We had 6 TV cameras there, stills cameras, you know, it was great. Cameras everywhere, people everywhere.
So but the truth is if you've got a distributor involved with your project that's putting up $200K for P&A costs, I mean, it goes a long way towards helping the film be successful, I think.
Still need a good film though.
That's right.
Yes, yes.
So we've done everything on our sheets of paper, so it's questions. Yes?
Yeah, as Stan's music video that he did for Bulletproof, was that just a coincidence? Did you guys end up using some of the shots in the film?
Take It Easy was the music video.
Take It Easy?
Take It Easy, not Bulletproof. Yeah.
No, so we used we used
film
footage from the film and some outtakes as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was a part of the strategy, definitely.
Right. Was it the same director as well, or?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. But the studio footage of him was shot in Australia where he recorded the song.
Okay.
That was shot by a company over there. The majority of footage was from the film.
Yes, at the back.
Can you just talk a little bit more about the release strategy with the track that you use it from? Did you release a track from the movie before the movie was released?
Yes.
Yeah, we didn't. I mean, Sony Music actually released it, but certainly part of we worked in with them in terms of releasing the soundtrack prior to the. I can't remember exactly when it was released, but it was certainly whether it was pre-Christmas, I can't remember. But it was certainly the idea was to release that and get some momentum for the film as well, and it actually was a very successful soundtrack as well. So it delighted on all fronts, and certainly got the movie off to a good start. And we worked pretty closely with the Sony Music team as well, just coordinating the whole thing and, you know, timing and so on. and keeping each other informed as to what was going on.
So we had two things. We had the soundtrack and we had the Take It Easy
Right.
single and music video.
And that was part of the strategy, a year out from releasing the film. Basically, when we realised that, when we knew that Stan was coming on board, I mean, that was just pretty obvious.
Yeah.
Yes.
I've got a question about, you set offhand, release it every Waitangi Day, but with technology now, PCPs, from a strategy point of view, are studios now looking at that sort of like one-off, single-day releases on more regular basis?
It could do. Again, you're competing for screen space, so when you talk to the exhibitor, they've got to be happy that, because if they're putting your film back on, usually the film rental's pretty low at that stage. You're only getting 25% back, which is quite low. But you've got to be able to convince them that they're going to get more out of that than they are out of the latest release that's only just sort of happened. So that's sort of one of the things. And generally, you might have to spend money as well as a distributor, so you've got to factor that in, take that into account
We'd
as well.
have to do a whole new publicity and advertising campaign.
Couldn't necessarily just put it out there and you just hope for the best. You might have to spend some money, maybe not a lot, but you might have to spend something to get it away.
Yes.
One of the things that came up this morning was getting school students, engaged with movies.
Yep.
And I see this at the beginning of the school year. So did you think at all about somehow putting out a school kit so that there was going to be part of the school media program for secondary school students?
We didn't really talk about it, to be honest. I mean, and you're right. It was at the start of the school year. It was certainly out of the school holidays. But we didn't really. At the end of the school year, sometimes you will have, particularly with primary schools, they will go and see movies as part of the wrap up in December. They don't really tend to do that at the start of the year. They tend to settling into the new year, but certainly that's a strategy for pre-Christmas or around about the 10th of December when the teachers are looking for things to do.
I've had a couple of companies approach me, who produce educational resources. Yeah, about turning it into an educational resource for schools. So there's a couple of ongoing conversations here. But so we have been approached. My point this morning in our session this morning was just talking more broadly about what I think is fundamental to improving the status of the fortunes of New Zealand film, which is about growing a generation for who New Zealand film is just a part of the everyday diet in the same way that we've overcome the stigma with New Zealand music. And I think the way to do that is to make films specifically for that audience, is my own personal opinion. And this is what I'm interested in looking at going forward after, maybe for my next couple of projects. I'm interested in looking at stuff that does target those audiences specifically, particularly for Māori and Polynesian. I mean, Andrew would have more insight into this than myself, but my understanding is that if you can get the, again, brown audience to turn out for a film, then the distributor is going to recoup its costs. And I think if you look at Māori demographics at the moment, we are pretty young people. So from a Māori perspective, I'm interested in maybe targeting that group. And the other thing I think that needs to happen, and be interested in other people's views, but I actually think we're really short of stars in New Zealand. If you look at the success of Mount Zion, my eyes just keep going to Stan Walker. That's a huge part of why this film was a commercial success. We don't have any stars in New Zealand, and particularly with our young people. We're talking about our young people. Stars are a big deal for them. They really do latch onto them. And you only have to look at something like the X Factor. Picking up 400,000 people on average watching that show. You can see that the effect that it has on our kids. So if we can create some stars, then I might be being naive. I was listening this morning that some of the top films, New Zealand films ever made in the box office. What Boy was about 10 million.
Yep, just under. Yep.
So maybe the top 3 films, maybe somewhere between 5 million and 10 million. Maybe I'm being way too naive here, but it seems to me that if we that there's the potential for that to be the norm rather than the exception, because obviously there's an audience there if you get the formula right. And for me, if we can create
we can create a generation, our kids coming through who are interested in local film in the same way that they're interested in local music and go and buy local music, well, there's no reason why $5 million box office film can't become the norm for some of our local films. So that thought alone really excites me, and that requires two things. I think focusing on our younger generation, and two, creating some stars.
Media studies is a huge growing subject in high schools these days. It's all around the country in almost every school. And those kids are really savvy and they're also really interested. We've had I'm a Western Springs College, and we've had a couple of occasions to be helping people developing their films, just audience feedback, stuff like that. And if that can happen more, if there's people in the room, then that can be helpful to you, and it will also be helpful to us. We'll be taking frantic notes because this is really good for us to teach our kids. And so they do understand, and they are keen to be involved.
Yeah, I mean, certainly Mount Zion was a lot of New Zealand films tend to, for want of a better, naturally gravitate towards an older audience. And in fact, we had the commission this week. We had a joint meeting with NZ on air, and we had a guy who was the head of the Australian Film Commission and he more or less said the same thing about Australian films. But Mount Zion was an exception, and I think Stan, and I guess the music were definitely appealing to that younger sort of demographic, and I think that's a good thing. That's a good thing, and certainly, obviously, we had prior to that we had Sione's Wedding 1 and 2, again probably similar demographic, maybe a bit broader. But I think Q's right. I think we can create some stars and some good scripts. Always got to have a good movie. I think there's every opportunity to get that younger audience.
Stan was also was nice to see that he was actually really good in the film. And I think there could have been a danger where I was worried that we're going to see the guy who has an amazing voice that couldn't cut it with the acting, and the fact that he could made it awesome. And I'd hate to see a star get pushed into, who's a great singer, get pushed into a film and go,
I was always personally confident that, because we weren't asking him to play Othello, who was sort of like playing maybe an extension of himself, and I could sort of see, a lot of people... If you don't have any experience, you can actually go the wrong way. You can, a lot of people said that to me, or do you think he'll be able to act? And I said, well, I think so. And also I was aware that he did actually have an acting coaching program of some sort, or was actually being mentored in that, and I actually think his performance was fine. That's good.
It was challenging, but just to draw a little distinction there, bro. When I talk about stars, I'm not talking about picking out our music stars and putting them in film. I'm talking about growing movie stars, growing actors as stars. But with Stan, it was challenging, bro, because a lot of people had the same. If I was being completely honest, there was a part of me that thought, well, if you come along to watch the train wreck, we still get a ticket. So there was part of me that was saying that, but you're right. In terms of the bigger picture, that's not good for our industry. The reason we were confident in Stan, basically we had to put a process in place, which meant that Taurup and I flew over to Australia a couple of times and screen tested him. I have an acting background. And it really did come down to, so I was reading opposite Stan, and that was the opportunity. I had, 2 years as a professional actor. I had kind of reasonably honed sensibility about sense of whether or not somebody could act. And so I read opposite him for a couple of days. That gave us the confidence that he could do the job. But we're certainly all aware, going into the release of the film, that the big question on many, many people's minds was, is it going to be a train wreck? And so, it's a valid point.
And how do you grow stars? How does that work? How does that start?
From the community that I'm most in contact with, I think some of those people are already there, and a lot of these, South Auckland for instance, if you look at various youth groups out there, it might be dance, it might be something performance related, there's always somebody there who is a star within that group, and I wonder if it's about finding those people and starting to give them movies, and I don't think they're going to be automatic stars overnight, but if we help build their stature as as New Zealand movie stars that our kids can latch onto, or maybe we get them from television. And the parallel I drew this morning with the music industry is because I remember when I was working at my firm, I mentioned it this morning, and to me, because I was seeing the programming schedule all the time, which was 5% New Zealand music and 95% American hip hop. And then Shay Fu released his song Come Break My Chains, and it just went off the chart. And suddenly it was on regular hourly rotate, which was unheard of. And it really was like the straw that broke the camel's back for me in my memory. And after that came Nesian Mystic, etc., etc. And so these were people that our young people had embraced as stars, and suddenly the whole music industry started to open up. And today we have a viable music industry. Musicians can have potentially a viable musical career here in New Zealand, which was unheard of when I was growing up. When we broke down those barriers, I think a couple of things, and one of them is the fact that we had stars that our kids could grab onto. And Stan Walker is maybe the modern today version of those success stories.
I think if you're talking about building stars, actors as stars, they've got to be able to have the opportunity to be in more than one film. And New Zealand industry's got a pattern of having somebody really big in one film, and then that's it, nobody else casts them. And I think people need to filmmakers need to think more broadly about the talent of individual people and not be afraid to put them in other films. Like, you know, who's going to be the next one to cast Stan Walker in an acting role? And I think that's the challenge, because he can do other things, you know.
That response, oh, you're overexposed.
Yeah.
You've done one thing.
Yeah,
How can you,
that's a really
how can you be
short-sighted view.
overexposed in the New Zealand film
Yeah.
industry? That's impossible. It's
That's right.
impossible.
Yeah.
Time for two more questions. Yes.
Kia ora, bro. I just wanted to ask, I heard you mention this morning about the sustainability sort of issue, and particularly like, you know, actually making what you do a sustainable career option, particularly in film rather than TV.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you guys had a real clear strategy domestically that obviously is paying off. Congratulations on that. Did you also have a dual kind of international strategy running as well, or did you feel like that would have been in conflict with just focusing on your primary audience, which it sounds like it was
I think during the creation of the film, we weren't thinking too much about an international. Just to be straight up honest, bro, we wanted to talk to our people. That was at the front of our mind. But it's that same old cliche, is that if you tell a good story, then it has universal appeal. And the Film Commission is responsible for international. They're our international agent, and we're just actually starting to go through the process of looking at international opportunities for the film now that it's had its local release and run its thing. So we've been invited to Imaginative and try. Actually, what's interesting about this film is it went to all the A-list festivals. So our short films, which were Taua and The Speaker, you know, received huge critical acclaim at A-list film festivals around the world. We got into competition at Clermont-Ferrand. Opened in Edinburgh and all these wonderful A-list film festivals. When it came to this film, we sent it out to all the A-list film festivals, and we didn't have any luck. And of course, they all come back and they got all the diplomatic responses of it's this, it's this, it's this. But from my point of view, I think when a film is categorised as an Indigenous film, which I kind of think this is, and which we're proud, I'm proud to say it's an Indigenous, we're Indigenous filmmakers. And when it goes out, I kind of feel with the film festivals, there's this mindset that an Indigenous film has to be worthy. And you know, Taua was a period piece, pre-colonisation, and so they ate it up with Mount Zion. You know, ironically, which has this commercial sensibility to it. Film festivals, the A-list film festivals, weren't interested. So we've gone down that track. Fortunately, we have had some great first festival shows some interest, which is good. So we're going to premiere at the Hawaiian Film Festival, our international premiere. We've been invited to the Hof Festival in Germany, and also we just received an invitation to Imaginative in Toronto as well. So yeah, the international journey is just beginning now.
So we've come to the end. So as you can all see, distribution doesn't stop. It goes on and on and on and on, and that's the beautiful thing. I think what round up relationships, if I get anything out of this, these three here have a relationship, and Christina I know well, I know everyone in Savage, what these relationships, as much as sometimes we want to be one-man-woman shows, our industry is about relationships. And I'd like to thank our panel this afternoon for being here, Quinton Hita, Andrew Cornwell and Sue May for sharing some very valuable information.